Alrighty, we are live. Welcome to another Properties and Beers. In fact, today's the Moomba edition of Properties and Beers. Look, I know for some of you, you're confused, right? Are Properties and Beers on a Monday? But the thing is, right, here in Victoria, well, I'm actually not in Victoria. I'll talk to you about that in a second. In Victoria, there's a public holiday called Moomba. Now, normally on Moomba, people jump off bridges dressed as superheroes. But in the property market, the media seems to think the prices are about to jump off a bridge too, right? So, right, let's talk about what's real, what's not real, or what's just another property crash headline that we're seeing. They come out every month or so, right? If you hear by they drop me a line, comment, all that sort of stuff. So let me ask you something, right? If homes in parts of Sydney are pushing $4 million, what does housing actually look like for our kids? And that's a really important question to ask because if you think the classic quarter acre dream where you can play backyard cricket is going to be the default option forever, I'm really not so sure, right? I was in India last month, and what I saw, they completely changed what I thought about the future of housing in Australia could look like. And tonight I'm going to unpack why, right? And by the way, this stuff's not just from India, it's from my visits in other places that have higher density living, and to see what the future could potentially look like. Now, before we start, for those that don't know me, my name is Gaurav Gupta, CEO and founder of Ethical Property Investments. I work with everyday Aussies, people like you and me, helping them invest in high cash flow ethical properties that are designed to do good in the community and make strong financial sense. That's right, do good and make money. We talk about real housing, work on real numbers, and value long-term thinking. And tonight I'm going to cover four things, right? What I saw in India when I was in February and what that could tell us about where the Australian housing could be headed. Why the whole boomers own everything conversation is a load of crap, and the data might surprise you. And the third thing I want to cover is this whole negative gearing conversation. I'm going to throw some data at you and let you guys make up your own minds. Of course, I'm going to give my 2 cents as well, but let you guys make up your own mind. And what this all means for investors right now, especially if you care about cash flow and sustainability, if you're watching this, you likely care about cash flow and long-term sustainability of your property projects, right? Now, let's talk about India and the future of housing. You're like, hey, India and the future of housing in Australia, how does that make sense? But before I do, I want to shout out to a special drink and tell you where I am. So let's get started with what is this? This is the Ras Malai Sour. Cheers, guys. Ooh, really nice. So there's Ras Malai Sour, and it is in a special bar, a special occasion. Let me read what it's made of. It is floral, frothy, and smoother than it should be. This is soft landing for a Negroni week. Gin, pistachio, saffron, cardamom, citrus, egg white, and rose. But I skipped the Campari, and I'm not a fan of the Campari bitterness. Delicious. I'll definitely get this again. All right. Now, tell you where I am. I'll show you around. Let's go for a little walk. So I am currently on the in Gili, Taronga, in a place that's special, close to my heart, Persona Resort. I'm just going to show you a little bit about what the ocean looks like. It's a bit of a cloudy day, but even though it's a bit of a cloudy day, let's see what it's like. That, my friends, I don't know if you can see, that's the ocean over there. It's not a bad place to be on a cloudy day, and it's gorgeous over here. I'll take you back to my hangout spot. It's a bit noisy here, so hopefully you guys can hear me. And if you're watching this live, drop me a line, say howdy. I'd love to see what you're about today. Okay, where are we? Now, when I was in India in February, something kind of really stood out, and it was a practicality. In many of the major cities, people in their 30s and 40s, they're not stretching for these massive standalone homes. In fact, they're not even stretching for like their single-story homes that their parents chose. They're choosing apartments. They're not talking about those old crap investor grade style apartments. In India and a lot of other Asian countries, they've actually completely rethought their model. We're talking about better shared spaces, really good designs, a real community feel. And that's a key thing, right? Community. Because as humans, we crave community most. The saying is it takes a village to raise a child. And part of that village is having the amenities close together. When you integrate the amenities, it makes all the difference. Now, apartment living over there isn't seen like a compromise. It's actually the way people want to live. Like, oh, you live in a society, an apartment. That's so cool. It's more cool than saying, hey, you live in a house. And it's interesting, new apartment developers are often outperforming older ones. That's right. So the newer apartments are actually worth more and grow more than older apartments. As soon as your apartment's like, 20 years old, it actually goes down in value. But if it's newer, especially in a society, it actually goes up in value, which is contrary to what's happening in, Australia, Canada, and all these other places, because at the end of the day, that reflects how people want to live. Now let's bring this back on. I know people sitting on $4 million homes in Sydney, and that works if you're already in or you bought cheap and you don't have a high mortgage. But if you really, really take a step back, you know, is that truly scalable for the next generation, our kids? Detached homes are moving further and further out. In fact, places like Melbourne are some of the biggest cities in the world in terms of kilometer size, but the population is quite small. Commutes are really getting longer, and like, you live in Sydney. If you live out in the west, you're not going to hang out in the south. You're going to just stay in your little pocket. And the infrastructure strains are there, as well as the affordability really tightening. And at some point, people will need to consider some form of apartment living. But the challenge in Australia, apartment living sucks, right? They often struggle for two reasons. First, they feel impersonal, built for yield, not lifestyle. By the way, I don't promote apartments in Australia at the moment, but I just want to talk about some things I've bought, right? Second, many are heavily student-driven or investor-heavy, which really isn't building community. And they're also not really built for family. And in the current state, apartment living in Australia isn't built for families. But people say, oh, apartment living overall aren't for families. I call bullshit on that. The society style living that we see in India, where apartments and townhomes exist within the gated community, for lack of a better term, is changing the damn game. We've got parks, high quality gyms, pools. Hell, I even saw, get this, golf courses, an 8-hole golf course, like world class, and a community and cinemas, right? So imagine cinemas and golf courses built into your little community. And now tell me, if you had gyms, parks literally downstairs, you had parks, you take your kids, hang out with the neighbors, go to the pool and say, okay, hey, this, and tell me you can raise your family in one of them. It's a new style of community, right? It goes beyond apartment living, more into community living, kind of like a vertical village. That's the best way to describe it. That's far from what we have in Australia. So don't take this into account of what Australia is right now. But I can see where the hesitation has, and it kind of makes sense when you talk about apartments in Australia. Here's my problem now. This is where I think Australia's got an opportunity, and this is where co-living itself becomes very relevant, because instead of stacking people vertically in anonymous towers, we're talking about intentional design for multiple working professions. And people are like, okay, what sort of people live in a co-living house? And you would typically find multiple working professions. A lot of our property managers won't even have anyone that moves in that doesn't actually have a job. So we're talking about real private spaces, not in a converted co-living, because we do some of that too in some locations, but in a purposeful co-living, everyone's got their own ensuite, right? And the shared areas there, they function really well. The thoughtful layout and strong management, and management is key to getting a co-living working. And at the end of the day, lower individual rental burden. We're talking $300 a week. If you're paying between $250 and $350 a week for a room, including bills, that's a good living life, right? So a good living experience, and that, my friends, is design evolution. So when shared living is done properly, people stay long. Here's what happens, right? People stay longer, community stabilize, cash flow improves, and value perception changes. So I'm not saying Australia becomes India or even Singapore. Heck, that model works in Singapore. I've seen it with my own two eyes. I've got friends that live there that invited me to their shared gated community, and it was amazing. It was the same thing, right? The community's rules for expats over there rather than impersonal apartments. When you check out Dubai, we've got sky homes over there. I've been personally to 3 and 4 bedroom apartments, and that's considered absolutely normal. We've got a 4-bedroom apartment that takes up half the floor and the entire floor, and they're not these 1-2 bedroom student apartments where we've got most Australian states happening. So people are chatting around me, right? So our markets are totally different, right? But they're forcing shaping housing over here in Australia. Rising land values, migration, urban concentration, that's all very real here too. Now, before I want to talk about another topic, I want to have another sip because it's delicious. Those that are just joining, this is a Ras Malai sour. Those that don't know what Ras Malai is, it's actually a Indian dessert, and these guys at Persona Resort in Dili Purong and have turned it into a damn drink. It's amazing, right? Uh, has a ras malai-ish flavor, but is more like a typical sour, which is fantastic. Now, I want to chat about a bit of an elephant in the room, and I don't have my pet elephant here to bring along, but Australian housing is some of the largest in the world where new homes are averaging, and I'll talk about the average actually, but we consistently outpace the United States and New Zealand in home sizes. That's right. New Zealand, which has got significantly less population per square meter, has smaller homes than us here in Australia. And so over the last 60 years, Aussie homes have doubled in size, right? Where the average household occupants have actually decreased. They've actually gone down by one person per house. And they're also significantly larger than the Europe, right? We're at the UK, where we're talking about new homes being 76 square meters. That's right. Smaller than the apartments we typically have. In the UK, we have 76 square meters. So I'm going to show some stats to you, right? So Australia, we're talking about 235 to 245 square meters of living space is the average house size in Australia. United States, 233, New Zealand, 202. Now, I'm confused. We have housing prices, yet the largest houses in the world with the same density as a place that effectively has 200 square meter housing, right? So it really is the McMansion formula, I think, is partially and only partially to blame for the housing situation that we're in. But add in all the craziness that exists and pressure from things like the government doubling their taxes over the last 7 years in housing, right? To build a house, now taxes wise, we've had over 100% increase over the last 7 years, and rising immigration. It's not like we can fix these things with a band-aid solution like taxing investors more or pausing immigration for a couple of years, like I see on all these Facebook things. It's just not going to work. We need a different formula to work. Look, we could learn a thing or two from these other places. So if detached housing becomes harder to access and traditional apartments continue to feel impersonal, well, then my friends, well-designed co-living might just sit in the middle. They're more affordable for tenants, they're more resilient for investors, and they're better aligned with how young professionals are actually living. So the key signal away I took from India was it wasn't like build more towers. It was actually more along the lines of design smarter shared housing. So it's a very different question, right? So the question becomes who adapts early? And if not for anything else, we have to look at making this change for our kids. That's my real honest belief. If we want our kids to be able to afford some form of housing, we've got to get our silver spoon out of our damn mouth in Australia and actually say, hey, maybe a shared community might be a better option. And I really hope developers start looking at that model, and I certainly will be lobbying some developers to do that and councils to approve that type of thing. Now, I'm going to keep having my... By the way, Queensland gets really close to doing that, especially in the Gold Coast and Brisbane areas, in terms of townhouses especially. I really like that vibe. Unfortunately, those areas don't grow because of strata management being a bit shitty. But that's something else that happens, right? So let's address something else that always comes up. Boomers own all the property. Like it's common belief, right? But guess what, my friends? As of 2026, analysis from like KPMG and the Australian Bureau of Statistics shows that Gen X born 1965 to 1980 here. I just missed out on that one, right? I'm 82. Now holds the highest average property wealth. I'll do some stats, right? So if you're doing average property wealth, Gen X roughly 1.45 mil. Baby boomers around 1.36 mil. We keep blaming the boomers for the housing crisis, but hey, Gen X are paying more for housing, own more in housing on average in terms of the dollar value than boomers actually do. And millennials, approximately 890. So it's interesting that millennials are a lot more. So really what's happening? Here's the thing, right? Boomers are losing their wealth. They're downsizing and they're shifting that equity into superannuations and cash, and they're beginning to pass deposits and wealth to their children. Let's stop blaming the damn boomers. They've done a hard job. And things are hard in their time, right? We have to, I'm going to borrow Joe Roganism, pull ourselves by our own bootstraps. Like, as each generation has to carve their own path, and we can't blame the generations before, right? Now, boomers are passing the deposit and wealth to their children. So let's take some of these rage-bait articles on news.com.au and other media with a grain or two of salt, right? Gen X holds more property value, but at the same time, big but, they also carry significantly more mortgage debt. They were leveraged higher than their parents were. And that is where, unfortunately, that's where the pressure really goes because debt levels are high, yields are tight. You know, the one tenant traditional model, I believe, becomes typically fragile. One vacancy, one extended maintenance issue, one interest rate shock, and it's all over. So instead of arguing about generations, maybe we should really ask a better question in line with what I said before. A high density world, what actually makes sense? So I don't believe it's a generation debate. We're talking about high prices, large mortgages, and tighter cash flow because of what the RBA is doing to claim that they're stopping inflation, which might be counterproductive when it gets to where it's at. It's a pressure debate, and when you're operating on a single income stream per property, the pressure builds up really quick. Right? So here's a question for you, right? What if the issue wasn't just property itself, but the way most people choose to play the game? And you know what? Here's the saying: apply the right pressure to coals, and it turns to diamonds. Apply the wrong pressure, and it vaporizes completely. So most landlords are operating on one-to-one model, and that worked in the past. That one property, one tenant, one income stream, it worked really well in the past. Now, unfortunately, in a market where we're having interesting rules put in by state governments, especially the Victorian state government, when one tenant leaves, income drops to zero, and they can hold that thing in VCAT or QCAT or whatever CAT situation in terms of court forever. I've had it happen in one case where a tenant didn't pay rent for 18 months. This is personally in one of our family's portfolio. We had zero income. He knew how to play the game, right? We got a little bit of income. He paid a little stipend on the last day his eviction notice was due, all that sort of stuff that really is unconscionable. Luckily, I was investing in another property type at that time that, had made up for this loss. It wasn't nice having that loss, but I'd invested in another property type that had made up for this loss. Look, over the last 9 years, we've worked on a completely different structure. We're talking about co-living. This is based on real-world execution, careful design, detailed numbers, and let me walk it through you. Let me walk a property, right? But before I do, let's have a sip. What happens if your tenant moves out tomorrow? As I was talking about earlier. In a standard property, you're sitting at 100% vacancy. Even with the low vacancy rate, sometimes there could be issues where a tenant plays games. Well, in a well-structured co-living home, you might have 5 to 9 to 12 income streams under one roof. And if one tenant leaves, you're sitting at 80% occupancy. And, when 2 rooms are vacant, you'll still earn rent from 3 tenanted rooms. Now, by the way, I'm going to pause it here. I know there's some people going, Goro, why are you building housing that's more dense? Well, forgive me, but for singles and couples, I don't see a further way to ease a housing crisis that we have. So, this way, I believe investors can do good and make money where the mortgage is covered. There may be cash flow positive, in some cases may not be. Most time, like 90% of the time, they are cash flow positive, but your cash flow remains resilient at the end of the day. And, we're going to change the emotional experience of investing. And if you're living in constant fear of your property being vacant and choosing not to invest in property just because of that, maybe co-living is something you should look at closely, right? Now, here's the other thing, right? How can you improve yield while making housing affordable? Let's say a market rent for a standard house is $700, $750 a week. The co-living setup, you might actually rent 5 rooms at like $250 to $350 a week, right? But each tenant pays something manageable and realistic for an income level. So yes, instead of earning $750, you'll actually earn closer to $1,500, which is pretty much double for that house. Yes, you do have to factor in like 10% for bills and all that sort of stuff. But collectively, the property generates like almost double what the standard lease model would do. Same mortgage. Like in a lot of cases, the houses are not much more to build than a standard house. But we're talking about a completely different income structure. And that's where the yield improvement comes from. We're talking about smarter structuring at the end of the day. Now, next week I'll cover some of this design being non-negotiable, right? Give me a second. I'm trying to figure out what's going on with it. They got loud music in the background with kids. Hopefully you guys can see me, right? So I'm going to talk to you about negative gearing. I've got some stats here I'm going to pull out. Now, I didn't write this article. I found this on The Age, right? So there's a proposal for restricting negative gearing that benefits, 2 properties per investor. Negative gearing benefits 2 properties per investor. We talk about it at the moment, Treasury's looking at it and, all the Peter Pans go, oh yeah, that'll make a huge difference. We're going to raise so much taxes from that. I call bullshit on that. Right? You know what? Let's talk about the numbers. They just do not stack up. I was checking out this article. I'm like, how much does that stack up, right? So here's the most recent ATO stats, right? They showed there was 2.2 million property investors in Australia 3 years ago. Of those, now that was the last stats that we found. Of those, about 1.17 mil were negatively geared. That's less than half were negatively geared property investors. Now, out of those, 810,000 of those, 73% only had one property, and 97% had three or more negatively geared property. Guys, do you know what that means in real numbers? That's 4% of the nation's property investors. Right? And I'm looking at because I'm reading this stat, right? 4% of property investors we're going to claim to penalize and say that's going to ease the housing crisis. Bullshit. Right? Let's look at the actual stats. Right? That's 97,000 investors having three or more negatively geared properties. My friends, if those investors don't like it, they could sell their investment properties to rental, move it into rental stock or whatever, right? Or raise their rent to cover the losses, which also could happen. That's a byproduct of, talking about changing tax laws. But here's the thing. Neither of those options would be sufficient. Both would lead to either higher rents or not significant change in housing affordability. 97,000 houses is a drop in the freaking bucket in terms of housing affordability. That's not going to change anything. So change this whole negative gearing and buying into this media spin about taxing investors. Oh, we should do it. It's okay. It's only 97,000 houses. It's not much, right? Do you know there's 810,000 investors who have one property that's negatively geared, yet only 97% have three or more properties, which is what they're claiming on taxing. It's a media headline to get more votes. Don't buy into the media spin, guys. I know if you're following me, you're simply stronger than that. And this is my rant for the day. Don't believe the media hype. And, next week I'm going to cover some other things that the government's planning to roll out because I'm going to spend longer talking about it than what the actual problem fixes. You know what? Decrease the tax ability, incentivize investors, and allow more things in other states like co-living. Because in places like Adelaide, you can't build a proper co-living, right? You can't build like a 5-9 bedroom property. That's what you should be doing. In Queensland, they're now charging in some municipalities like $40,000 to build a proper co-living rooming house. Why? Why penalize investors? In fact, when they're the ones, these guys are the ones trying to make the housing crisis go away. You know what happens when a co-living property is built poorly and in a wrong location? It stays vacant. That doesn't hurt the housing crisis, but if it's built right in the right location, that significantly, makes the housing crisis better. That's my belief. Now, if any of what I've talked about spark your interest, we're going to be running a dedicated co-living webinar on March the 26th. It's completely free for an hour and a half, 1 hour, however long it takes. We're going to walk through the exact numbers, the design pipelines, the compliance considerations, and yes, the risk, the good, bad, and the ugly. This is where the strategy works, doesn't it? We're going to walk through I've got some videos and photos of actual co-living houses we've built for our clients before. And if you're serious about understanding where housing is heading and how to position yourself properly, this is something you really shouldn't miss. The registration link, I'll chuck it in the description. Take the time to learn it properly. Now, before I go further, here's guys. Tonight we've covered something so much bigger than the latest property trends. I think we've talked about where housing is heading, government policy, where generational wealth conversation happens realistically. And hopefully we've explored you adapting your investment model to what's truly happens today rather than blaming the past. Because at the end of the day, housing in Australia needs to evolve. We need to create more density because the debt levels are higher and the margins are tighter. Now, the investors who adjust thoughtfully and tend to stay calm when the market shift are the ones that are going to be the winners. Now, before we wrap up, there's something important. Most of you watching right now haven't followed our page yet. You tune in, you watch, you engage. But if you're not following ethical property investments on Facebook and Instagram, that means you're missing out on our cool updates, right? Put a lot of time into sharing practical education to help investors just like you make better quality decisions. So if you found tonight valuable, make sure you hit follow, stay in the loop, because the market doesn't stand still, and neither should your knowledge. Now, thanks for joining me for another Properties and Views. See you on the webinar on the 26th or next Friday, whatever it is. Make sure you secure your free spot because they're limited. And I'll see you at the next session. Cheers, guys.